In October of 2023, my family discovered my great-grandmother's military pension application.
Under the Military Pensions Act of 1934, this file relates to May Casey's unsuccessful pension application. May Casey, a Ní claims active service during the War of Independence, Truce Period and Civil War.
I spoke to my great-aunt, May Breen, who is May's daughter, to learn more about her mother's personal life. I also sat down with Aoife Torpey, an archivist in Kilmainham jail, to learn about May's time as a political prisoner in 1923. I travelled to Dublin, where I discovered the places May experienced exactly 100 years ago. This is the story of how I investigated the secret life of my great-grandmother, May Casey.
The information we have on May's arrest comes from her own pension application that she made several years afterwards, and she says she's arrested in February 1923. She doesn't say specifically why she's arrested, but in her pension application she gives details on what sort of activities she was involved with. So dispatch work, which is carrying messages, moving arms and ammunition around Dublin, but also being involved in keeping safe houses for IRA men too.
She claims she collected arms funds for the IRA, disguised as funds for the Padderlacken Literary Society.
I don't know whether it was when she met my father. I don't honestly know. But I know she used to help out when they wanted somebody moved or something moved out. And she would hold on to the things for them. And my mother never spoke about it. As I said, when I was small, if adults were in a room and talking, out the door. Children were never allowed to listen to anything. One night when we were over in Jones, somebody started a conversation. I heard about things that I never even knew about, even at 93. Now I don't even know how she was arrested or anything.
So she's arrested in February 1923. She says she's brought to Portobello Barracks, which is now Cahilbrua Barracks, and interrogated for a few hours, and then she arrives in Kilmainham jail, where she joins quite a number of other female prisoners who were already being held there. Kilmainham during this point was female only for the very first time in its history.
Before operations, she claims she transported arms and ammunition to various arms dumps. During the Battle of Dublin, she transported 29 rifles in a pram, from 100 Haddington Road to her home in Torncastle Street.
That's in Haddington Road, yes.
Do you remember growing up there?
Oh, I do. It was a different house altogether than what it is now. Once I left Haddington Road, you lose touch then with all the people around, you know. I never was involved. I never wanted to be involved.
For when the women were here in 1923, there are no other prisoners in Kilmainham jail. It's just these political women. So they have a lot of rights as political prisoners that they wouldn't as ordinary. So they're allowed to wear their own clothes. They'd be allowed out to sit in each other's cells. They would walk around the jail and just communicate with each other much more freely than ordinary prisoners were allowed. They're allowed to receive parcels and letters from home. They would play rounders and handball. They managed to pull apart the gas light and put a frying pan over it. They certainly have a different experience of prison than ordinary prisoners would have, but they're still in jail. You are surrounded by walls and barbed wire and soldiers. So May herself says that she was on hunger strike for 14 days. They weaponised their own bodies because it was the only weapon they had. The women would hunger strike for release. I want you to release me and I'm not going to eat until you do. In March 1923, 96 women went on hunger strike for their parcels and letters to be reinstated, and when they were, they came off. It's a very serious form of protest, and some of the women thought that this is how we should protest because it's a very frightening concept that we might let a woman die on hunger strike.
Oh, she was a lovely person. She was real kind. I remember Nora. She used to say, like, she could sit down and talk to my mum about anything, and she painted a bit, you know, when she was in Kilmainham. She took a beautiful box of paints that her father had bought her.
We know of several women who received paints while in prison. The most famous is Grace Gifford Plunkett, who had married her husband Joseph in the jail in 1916 before he was executed the next day. So it is possible that May's paints got stopped, her parcel got completely stopped, and she didn't get them that way. But it is also possible that they got confiscated. There were accusations by the women that the guards had been taking choice things from their parcels. They occupy their time in doing those things because prison is really boring and you have to entertain yourself somehow.
Casey states she worked alongside D Company, 3 Battalion, Dublin Brigade, and the Irish Volunteers under the command of Michael and Sean Cullen from 1917 to 1918. During the truce period, May Casey claims she took part in first aid training. She collected £330 at the Irish Republican Prisoners Dependents' Fee. She claims she participated in anti-conscription work, election work for Sinn Féin, and storing arms. During the War of Independence, May Casey claims she was a member of the Ringsend branch of Cumann na Bán. She claimed that these were under the command of Mrs. Heron and Frank Casey. After a raid on Bamba Hall by British forces, she claims she rendered first aid to men in the Galway Hotel.
In Kilmainham jail, she was held in a cell which she nicknamed Fighting 3rd D Company, and this is the IRA company she was associated with. She was transferred at some point to the North Dublin Union. She's definitely there in June 1923 because she signs an autograph. On the night of the 30th of April 1923, the women of the East Wing were informed that they were going to be moved, and they refused to go. 2 of their number were on hunger strike, Mary McSweeney and Kathleen O'Callaghan, and the women were afraid if they were moved that no one would be there to look after them, so they refused to go. They go up on the top floor of the East Wing, they link arms, they hold onto the bars, and soldiers with their faces covered or blacked are brought in to drag them down physically. Across several hours, the women are dragged down one by one. Some get their hair pulled, their heads smacked against railings. Some give as good as they get. They kick the soldiers, they smack them with their suitcases full of books. The local people in the area actually report hearing it, thinking that they're killing these women. In the midst of all of this, Kathleen O'Callaghan and Mary McSweeney are released. They said, "We would go quietly if you released those 2 prisoners." When it finally happened, they do. We don't know whether May was one of those. We would hope for her sake that she wasn't. But in the North Dublin Union, she is probably held in the hospital. She says that she developed a big illness after her hunger strike. So when she's not in the hospital, she's in a dormitory called Deabhall Gan Cura, which means Devil May Cares. And again, this is a nickname that the women give to the dormitories themselves. Perhaps these women in these dormitories are a bit mad, a bit excited.
And she loved whist drives. Never had a house without cards at Sunday night, and my mother and father would go to their friends and they would play cards.
So we have a letter in the Kilmainham collection which says that Al Keane, who's Lil Keane, had been released on Saturday and May Gagan the same. So this letter is dated the 30th of July 1923. It is released in and around the end of July 1923. She also gives May the nickname Pincushion, which we can't figure out what it means. It's an in-joke that we weren't part of, but it's still very interesting.
In Haddington Road, there were lovely cushion covers, and she used to do embroidery with beads on them.
And then we also have some autograph books. They hand them around to their fellow prisoners to create a memento of their time in prison. So you and me in prison together, basically. May writes pretty much the same thing in all of the autograph books. She writes her name and her address in Sandymount, and then she writes her cell nickname, Fighting 3rd D Company, Kilmainham, and Deabhall Gan Cura in the North Dublin Union, or Devil May Care. So this is how she wants to be remembered, that she was in Kilmainham and the North Dublin.
Casey states that her father was a master stevedore and had a contact from the British Admiralty to unload munition ships from the Dublin docks.
He was a master stevedore.
She passed on information from the docks to Sean Condren. Some of the British arms on these ships were taken by IRA forces.
I often wondered, was it that she just met my father and he was in that? He was captain of the 3rd Battalion, the old IRA. I remember a lot of people used to come in and out because he was over the area that was doing all those pensions. In the dining room, you wouldn't be able to go into the room because he'd have people in. I remember that as a child, but Cavalier's wife sent a letter to my father on his father's death, but they were like kind of involved.
May's later husband, Frank, he was arrested on the 1st of July 1922. He had been involved in the fighting in Dublin during the start of the Civil War, but he was arrested and brought to Portobello Barracks, but he managed to escape after 8 days with a number of men, and he goes on the run.
May Casey states she secured a safe house for Frank Casey after his escape.
So in Dundalk in September 1922, he's arrested again.
May Casey also claims she visited Frank Casey while he was arrested in Dundalk. She states that she transported dispatchables from him to Ernie O'Malley.
Then he is brought to Newbridge, which is an internment camp in County Kildare, then to Mountjoy Prison in Dublin, and then he arrives in Kilmainham Jail on the 20th of October 1923. We've an official typed list of the prisoners who arrived here on that date.
He always, I remember, carried a gun and he'd come home and he'd always put it up the very top of a wardrobe that the lads wouldn't see. He used to visit the embassies. That was when he was in the special branch.
They started a hunger strike in Mountjoy at midnight on the 14th of October 1923. When he arrives at Kilmainham Jail, they're still on hunger strike. It wasn't the first hunger strike during the Civil War, but it was the biggest. The fighting of the Civil War had ended, but there are still lots and lots of people who are in prison. So the hunger strike was undertaken to demand that they be released. At its height, there are over 8,000 people on hunger strike. Hunger strike starts at midnight on 14th of October 1923. The effects of hunger are very serious. So by November 1923, there's around 170 still on hunger strike. They read books, they write letters, biographies of Dutch revolutionaries and all these interesting books. Ernie O'Malley reads Jane Austen, and one of the prisoners, Pat Coughlin, actually gets 22 of his fellow prisoners to sign their names on these cards while they're on hunger strike, and Frank signs one of those, and that's on display in our museum. The hunger strike is called off on the 23rd of November 1923. Their demands haven't been met, they haven't been released, their conditions in prison haven't changed. They've been very weakened by their hunger strike, which lasts 41 days. So he's in prison from November 1922 till March 1924, so quite a long period of time. There's over 12,000 men and 600 women interned between 1922 and 1924. So it's an interesting period in Irish history anyway.
We married in 1927. Joan was the eldest, then Frank, and then I was next, and then Tony, and then Sean. I'm the only one alive out of that film, and I was born in 1930. That photograph and the one inside is the only one I have of the family, really. My mother was in the Red Cross and she used to do all that work. And during the end of the war, then they had German children evacuated, and she used to go into Westland Road when the trains would come in, and she would be there to look after the children. Things like that you'll always remember, that way. He's 70 years nearly now when she died.
In this tribute to my great-grandmother, I hoped to shine a light on the activities of the political life of a person we never knew anything about. Although she fought tirelessly on the anti-treaty side of the war, May's pension application was unsuccessful because she was a woman. To me, May Casey was once just a face in an old picture frame, but now she will be commemorated by our family for her commitment to a cause she believed in for years to come, and her story will never be forgotten.